We'll start, inshallah, today by a short review of what we talked about last week, about the seerah of Sheikh Muhammad Abduh, and inshallah we'll discuss today his ideas, his thoughts, and his impact on his contemporaries and his impact on future Muslim thinkers, as well as non-Muslim thinkers, particularly those who are influenced by the nationalist and patriotic aspects of his views and thoughts. Last time we left Sheikh Muhammad Abduh having returned from exile or self-exile in Europe and Lebanon. He came back to Egypt in 1889, and on the back of an agreement that he had with the ruler of Egypt not to get involved too much in domestic political affairs. And in the process, he basically reinvented himself as a pedagogue, as a person who was concerned about the reform of Muslim educational institutions and the moral and spiritual life of Muslims generally, together with modernistic attempts to begin the process of reinterpreting the Quran al-Kareem to take into account contemporary and modern perceptions. So, his original life, as it were, life of a political activist as the prime follower and disciple of Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani, basically ended with his departure from France, from Paris, and ended with the collapse of the newspaper Al-Wafqa, which, if you may recall, in the past was an important influence on the evolution of Muslim thoughts and ideas in the mid and late 19th century. And you can therefore discern really three phases to Sheikh Muhammad Abduh's life. The first phase, if you'd call it, is probably from his youth to the period when he met Sayyid Jamaluddin. And there I would think his life was, to some extent, defined by his education in the Azhar, and particularly the influence of his maternal uncle, Sheikh Darwish, on his outlook and mainly on his tasawwuf. So he was a person who was concerned primarily with the cultivation of the inner life, with reaching intuitive rather than rational understandings of revelation, and he was immersed in the practices and the doctrines of Al-Tariqah. In the second phase of his life, you can say he was the Muslim activist or the political activist, where he emerged on the scene, particularly in Egypt, as one of the great theoreticians and definers or polemicists of the Egyptian national movement, and began to become associated very, very intimately with the works and with the program of Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani, which ended up in his editorship of the Al-Wafqa, and which gave the world the activist Sheikh Muhammad Abduh that we all know. The pan-Islamist, the person who called for the unity of all Muslims, the person who transcended national and particularist notions of political action to propagate what became known as the Jamia al-Islamiyya or pan-Islam. The third version, or the third phase in his life, and here I don't think we're talking about conversions. It's not that he converted from one set of ideas, one set of thoughts to another. It was more like, neither was it an evolution. It was perhaps an emphasis. He emphasized certain aspects of his character, became more emphasized and more delineated within certain historical periods. And the last period of his life, which is possibly the most active and productive in terms of his impact on people and on his impact on the evolution of ideas, is the period when he became known as the pedagogue, the educationalist, the person who looked for the moral, spiritual revival of the Muslim world, and who began to propound the notion of the reform of Islamic institutions, particularly educational institutions, Islamic knowledges in terms of how to interpret and understand sacred texts in the context of modern perceptions. This is the tertiary period of his life, or the third version of Muhammad Abduh, and that's the version, I think, as I said, that had most impact and most influence on the subsequent generations. When he came back, he, as you know, was the editor of the official Egyptian literary gazette. It was called Al Masriya, which was more than just a kind of Hansard. It was more than just a parliamentary journal that reviewed all the laws and so on. It had an extra editorial role, and it involved him in being, in some ways, the censor, the official censor, the official, the person who gave the stamp of approval over publications and books that came into Egypt. So from that perspective, his role as the editor of the official gazette, he blew it up, or he enhanced the role to include that of official censor, and in that role he had an important, as it were, barrier to the stopping the flow of books that he did not approve of, and ideas, therefore, that he did not approve of, and began to form or shape the educational material that he thought was suitable to the Egyptian moment. So, if you go back to his earlier life, that is, what can we discern? I mean, what is the common thread in his life? What is the thing that joined his early youth, with his middle period, with his end period? There have been many commentators who have taken different perspectives of his character and reached different conclusions. Is Sheikh Muhammad Abduh the pan-Islamist activist? Is that what he comes across to you? Does he come across to you as the redefiner of sacred texts, in particular his modernist tafsir of the Quran, which is known as Tafsir al-Manar subsequently? Or was he the spiritual, inner-oriented person of his youth? I pose the question really without giving an answer, because his variegated character, as it were, has given rise to a number of different interpretations. So you have one school represented by the article that I gave you, or the chapter that I gave you by Zeki Hedawi, that really is not very favorable to him as a person. He comes across as a very acerbic, somewhat stubborn man of some intelligence, but not of great genius. A person who, by and large, was more of a, I won't say a wrecker, but a person who did more harm than good in his work. His attempts to modernize, or to so-called modernize, Islamic institutions, rather than recreating them in a mold that would be flexible, that would be more pertinent to the needs of Muslims, in fact opened the floodgates to increasing secularization and westernization. His attempts to find common ground between various madhabs, between various Islamic schools of fiqh and law, led to a situation where the brushing over of really very real differences, doctrinal differences, dogmatic differences, became of secondary importance, which is not necessarily reflected in the actions and the beliefs of people. On the other hand, you have, for example, Albert Horan, who writes about him in the context of being a modernizer, as being part of the so-called Nahm. This is a word that crops up all the time amongst Arabs who are interested in this period. Now there was a people's renaissance. This whole group of people who began to look at Islam from a different vantage point, from the vantage point of the modern world, from the vantage point of the effect of Western and secular ideas. These are all grouped in one block as another, and he generally has a positive view. That is, these are the people who open the eyes of the Muslims to the possibilities inherent in adjusting to the Western world, to the secular world, without necessarily losing their bearings. So he features as one of the luminaries of that period. If you look at the national or the nationalist apologists, he again comes up as one of the earliest proponents of Egyptian nationalism and may have been in some distant past a forerunner of people like Abduh Nasser. So various people look at him in different ways, in different perspectives. My own conclusions about him I leave until the end of the lecture, but let's look at where his ideas fell in various categories. And I'll use the same categories as Zeki Badawi, which are not really inappropriate. This affects on politics, political politics. His effects on moral law. His effect on legal jurisprudential. Let's take them one by one. Political thought. I think nobody would make the claim that he was a great political theoretician. He wasn't. Sheikh Abduh was not of a great political mind. He did not come up, he's not a Mawardi, he's not a person who came up with entirely different perspectives as to what Islam means in the context of modern notions of political legitimacy, notions such as democracy, constitutionalism, liberalism, representative governments, all of these things. So the political thought of Sheikh Abduh to some extent was derivative. I think it derived primarily from two fundamental factors. One of them, and this runs throughout his life, even though towards the end of his life, or in the tertiary period, as it were, of his life, he became an apologist, as it were, of British rule, or he accepted British rule or British sovereignty over a Muslim country. Nevertheless, I think he was mainly concerned in his political ideas with the effect of the West, a dominant, triumphant, aggressive, expansionist West, against a declining, decrepit, in some cases, completely naked East. An East that has no means of defense, has no means of resistance to this West at this point. And the effect of that on his personality and on his politics, I think, were really very, very profound. And from there, I think, you can trace a common thread. You can trace, for example, his resistance to British imperial rule and his association with Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani as one aspect of that. Another aspect of that, paradoxically, when he accepted British rule, he tried to justify it in the context of that a person who is completely bereft of power, bereft of any ability to defend himself, he has no choice but to accept the dominance of the other, awaiting the chance and the possibility of his rebirth, of his renaissance. So he did not become a defender of British rule because he thought the British were superior or the West had a superior moral or political order. But he said that it was a matter of expediency. You have no choice, given that these people have defeated you, given that these people have injected into your midst their institutions, their modes of government, their modes of organization. Resistance is futile. We tried it and we got defeated. Therefore, we should do the best that we can with this, while using that period where we are being dominated in order to reform and to prove ourselves. So, this is one trend in this talk. The need to redefine your state, your status, your being within the context of your own traditional institutions, but drawing as much as possible from not only from the more acceptable forms of modernization, but trying to delve into the spirit of modernization and reconcile it with Islam. So his Islam, his political Islam, was an adaptive, absorptive Islam. It wasn't an Islam that was to be replaced lock, stock and barrel. It was an Islam that is to be modernized in a way that allows it to mesh with the contemporary currents and trends.
Sorry. You said modernized instead of adaptive. Is there a difference? Because
yes, he came up later on, inshallah, we'll talk about it when we get to his moral law. Is that he began to internalize by taking certain approaches and certain attitudes to key doctrinal issues. For example, by stressing the need to transcend sect, he came up with a situation where something that was not necessarily current in the Muslim thought preceded it. He enshrined the possibility of what is useful in the form of maslahah, utilitarian, as being a principle of Islam. Now, there are really two different things by absorbing something from abroad that is alien, that's extraneous to you, and by adjusting to it, is different from saying that what that form presents to you is in fact available within your own tradition if you look at it from a different perspective. And it is this perspective that has really become part and parcel of modernist Muslim thinking. That is, whatever you find that is good in the world, and he interprets good and evil in different ways, I'll talk about later. Whatever is defined as useful becomes good. And therefore, if you see something in the West that is useful in the sense that it makes people's life easier, it makes society's life more possible, it allows for introduction of technologies, innovations, and so on. The notion of utility, seen in an inter- or intra-sectarian way, is alien to the Muslim mind. People used to see things, and still do in many cases, in their own perspective, taking their own rules of conduct, their own rules of how to reach conclusions. He, by brushing over all these differences and introducing a rather limited concept, by broadening a rather limited concept, he allowed the very dramatic changes to take place, justified not by the fact that they are manifestly superior on the outside world, in the rational sense, but justified as being part and parcel of the Muslim tradition properly understood. So, as I said, you have things like, for example, riba. Now, the ayahs to do with riba are many, and the dangers of being riba, danger of being a person, a group of people who are involved in the aspect of money lending and interest are legion. I mean, Quran talks about them as being one of the worst. It's one step lower than shirk in terms of the Islamic creed. But since banks are manifestly of benefit, according to them, they are of benefit to society in the sense that they mobilize savings from a very large number of people, concentrate them, and then make them available. This is of benefit to society, as he understood it. Therefore, that notion of utilitarianism, of utility that is attached to banks, runs counter to Quranic injunctions against them. But he said that if you read the Quranic injunction correctly, you'll end up with a conclusion that allows you to do these things. It's a kind of, I won't say it's a warped ijtihad, but it's an ijtihad that is predetermined. The conclusion is predetermined because you want something to happen, or you want something to become generalized. And this kind of thinking, which was very alien before, you did not find people justifying conduct or justifying institutions or systems using fiqh, using kalam, except in a very, very narrow way. But he blew all that up. So you have all kinds of things being introduced into the body, the main body of Islam, but justified on the Islamic quote-unquote principle of utility. One of the concepts, we talked about riba here, but one of the concepts that comes more under his political form, that allowed also for alien concepts to introduce themselves into the Muslim life, is his notion of watan, or his notion of nation, or watan in Arabic is more like patria in Latin. It's not so much the nation. Now, watan and his wataniya, by attributing certain qualities to watan, or the notion of country or country, he went beyond people like we talked about last time, Tahtawi. Tahtawi is talking about the intuitive love of land people, the unity that exists amongst people who are of the same geographic notion. He expanded this idea. He expanded this idea so that it went beyond the community of believers. Tahtawi, if you recall, was not so much concerned about inter-ethnic cohabitation, as it were, in Egypt. He was much more interested in coexistence. He was more interested in his Egypt was the Egypt of Muslims. Christians were there, but they had a certain role and a certain position, and they may have had the same relationship to their Egypt, but it came from a different perspective. It was not the same perspective. The perspective of Sheikh Muhammad Abduh was more that of co-citizenship, and by allowing the notion of citizenship to go beyond the notion of ummah, what binds people together. What binds the ummah of Islam together is the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the love of the Prophet, certain things that are common to all Muslims, irrespective of their geographic disposition, irrespective of their race, color, or whatnot. By bringing that notion of loyalty, of religious loyalty, I'm not talking about civic loyalty, I'm not talking about the loyalty that a person has to the civil institutions, but to giving it a spiritual or religious dimension. The idea of watan began to seep into the European concept of nation. The European concept of nation is far more linguistically based, it's far more ethnically based, it's far more culturally determined. That notion of nation is not the same as the prophetic injunction to love your watan, or to love your those things that bind you with your neighbors, or those things that bind you with your city or with your area. It goes beyond that. It gives it a certain dimension that is much more, quote unquote, European, much more 19th century French Revolution concept of what a nation is. Now, there were a number of other people in the Muslim world who accepted the notion of nation and nationalism from a completely secular perspective. But these people never claimed any religious dimension to the concept of nationalism, to the concept of nation. Sheikh Hamad Abduh did. Sheikh Hamad Abduh inverted on its head the Islamic love of the place where you're born, the landscape, to the relationship with the other people. He inverted it to a concept of more akin to a European nation. And in the process, he allowed a certain religious acceptability within the notion of Islam, within the vanguard political thinkers, as it were, within the Muslim world, to combine Islamicism with nationalism. And you find, especially in the anti-colonial struggles in Africa and Asia and so on, in the early days, there's always very close cooperation between secular nationalists and those who come from a traditional Islamic perspective. This is true in our world, it's true in some of the African countries, it's certainly true in the Far East. But of course, these break apart once the foreign threat is removed. And this identification of European notions of nationalism with Islamic understanding of what love of watan is, basically supplanted in the Muslim mind the concept of ummah as being the primary political focal point. I'm not saying it's all due to him. It's probably not even partly due to him. But in one area of the world, one area of the Muslim world, Egypt, this certainly had profound effect and allowed nationalists, as it were, secular nationalists, to get away with quite a lot by linking the European notion of nationalism with Islamic understandings of ummah. And I must say, this unequal struggle, as it were, the nationalists always got the better of the traditional Islamists until probably very recently. In nearly everywhere. If you look at the Algerian struggle against the French, again, a very close alliance between secular nationalists and Islamists, or people who are motivated primarily by Islamic philosophy. As soon as the war was over, the secularists turned against the Islamists, and out they go. Now, the masses were mobilized not in the name of the European notion of nation. They were mobilized primarily by an understanding of their religious requirements under the notion of ummah. Same thing happened in the Far East, in Indonesia, I'm sure you're aware about after the war, the struggles that ended up with the supremacy of Sukarno people was primarily due to the careful and selective exploitation of the latitude given to nationalism within the Islamic tradition by people like Sheikh Hamad Abduh.
Question concerning love of water. I came across, I'm not sure whether it's this or whether it's Sahih, Ukul Watan min al-Iman.
Yes. That is what one of the prophetic hadith refers to. But the watan that the Prophet ﷺ was talking about was not the watan that is the same as Robespierre's nation. It's two different political perspectives, two different notions and two different definitions of what constitutes watan. Watan is, in the Islamic sense, is the landscape, your land, your relationship with family and friends, your neighborhood, the locality, the culture of the locality. So love of that is part of your faith because it is part of your fiqh. You have grown up. I come from a place which is deserty. In my mind, this is the landscape that will stay with me throughout my life. It's a natural orientation towards a certain set of values, to a certain set of cultures, to a certain set of geography. That is what that is the Islamic way. It does not assume that watan is going to have certain philosophical and certain political underpinnings to it. The European concept of nation is different. The European concept of nation assumes not only certain commonalities, it is linguistically based, it is based on, in some cases, race, it is based on a certain sense of predetermined destiny, it's based on a certain sense of rushing or interacting with history and historical forces. So you talk about the destiny of this nation, or you talk about the destiny of France is to carry the banner of liberty throughout the world. This is not watan. This is the ideology of a nation, giving or limiting to a certain group of people certain philosophical, ideational, and ideological values. This was not known in Islam. And to some extent, it's alien to the notion of Ummah. In fact, it contradicts the notion of Ummah. Because Ummah does not assume that people have to have the same linguistic or cultural background in order for them to be within one orbit, within one ambit. It assumes that the Ummah of Islam is the Ummah of believers. It is not the Ummah of Persian speakers or the Ummah of Malay speakers. There are different ways of looking at this. So, by bringing these two together, he affected both the geographic determinism, as it were, of the notion of Wataniya of people like Rafah al-Tahtawi, with the European notion of a nation of destiny, a nation of ideology, a nation that has... And from that you have all this nonsense that came up with borrowed nationalism. Things like parades and flags and so on. These are all part of the paraphernalia that came with Western notions of nationalism that were improperly imported into the political army, as it were, of power seekers in our part of the world. I'll come back to this issue of this moral law and how he began to see things, how his moral structure, as it were, his understanding of what good and evil is, allowed him to reach certain doctrinal principles from which emerged a whole stream of fatwas and rulings that he was very good at giving.
Is he a rationalist? Did you say he's from that camp?
He's a rationalist up to a point. He's a rationalist to a point where he did not presuppose the supremacy of reason over revelation. I think in many ways he said something else. He said that revelation demands reason. But to him revelation and the possibility of reaching certainty through revelation is always, I think, has the upper hand of the reason. But he has a very peculiar relationship with reason, inshallah, we'll talk about. There's this article in Arabic where he talked about the akhlaq, which referred to someone as the basis of what I was talking about. He described actions as really composed of there are three kinds of actions. Of course, he goes back to the traditional definition of good and evil in Islam. Now, good and evil in Islam is not necessarily the same as in English or in Western. Good is al-khair, which can be good, it can mean something of benefit, not necessarily. Or al-jameel. That is beautiful. So good is to some extent equated with beauty in the Western sense. But the two Arabic terms, khair and jameel, are different. And evil is the opposite. Whatever does not have elements of goodness or beauty becomes ugly. So, both actions and people have both of these qualities. Both of these qualities are in various amounts. And to some extent this comes from, I think, from his earlier education in Tasawwuf. Those of you who have ever come near the traditional teachings of Sufism, you'll find out that when they talk about akhlaq or ethics, very poorly translated as ethics, it is always a balance that there are various contradictory characteristics or attributes that are in a person and therefore in his actions. And the whole point about being on a certain spiritual way or a spiritual path is to ensure or to work so that the better qualities, the better attributes, begin to predetermine your actions. The better qualities, the better attributes overtake the uglier attributes, the more evil attributes. And in the process, you work towards moving upwards into a hierarchy where you perfect yourself. This is really traditional Sufi teachings, of which he was an early adept, an early devotee. And I think it reflects back into his later moral philosophy, as it were. He said there are three kinds of actions. First one, that is intrinsically good. Whatever it is. For example, he says that if you hear music, fine music, it's good because it appeals to higher qualities in you. Now, of course, music, maybe I use the wrong example about music. This is what he talks about in his article on Ruhaniyat, Allah wa Ruhaniyat. The second aspect of this is that an action is good or bad depending on its consequences. So, let's say this is dependent on consequences. So, whatever you do or whatever you say may or may not be immediately defined as good or bad, but the consequences of your actions are going to be determined by the goodness or evil of your actions are going to be dependent on the consequences attendant to it. And the third type of action, the third type of yardstick that you use is the yardstick of utility, the benefit of your action. Now, we can see from this kind of moral definition of what is good or evil. And here we go back again to the traditional Muslim perspectives. Of the Mu'tazila or the Ash'ariyya. You can see how he has taken traditional texts or medieval texts, distilled them in terms of their conceptual format, related these conceptual formats, which are devised and derived from different periods. I mean, the issue of good and evil for the Mu'tazila, say, of 1,000 years ago, do not necessarily have the same import as they do to a 19th century person. But he was very careful in doing it. He took concepts like good and evil, contemporized them, as it were. So these became, as it were, the umbrella under which he discussed issues of action. If morality and ethics relate to one's actions, and one's actions are either good or bad according to traditional definitions, then you don't need to explain away these concepts. What you need to do is take these concepts and relate them to your definition rather than traditional definitions. Because in the Muslim mind, there's a general recognition of what is khair, what is jameel, and there's a general recognition of what is batil, what is not khair, what is not jameel. Once you take these categories as given, you can then play around with these concepts to come up with a theory of action that allows you to define good and bad in these terms. And this is, again, a major paradigm shift, as it were. A major shift in people's perceptions as to what are the acceptable in terms of the deen, in terms of the fiqh, in terms of the theology, what is theologically acceptable, and doctrinally acceptable, and dogmatically acceptable in their actions.
Doesn't this mean, I don't know if I'm understanding it correctly, but does this mean you've got free license to do practically anything you want?
Yes, on these terms. The action can be intrinsically good. Like if you see, I don't know, if you see a person who is hungry or thirsty and give him a meal, that is in and of itself good, and therefore is justified not only by the intrinsic nature of the action, which is goodness, but is justified also by the doctrinally understood notion of what is good and evil. If you do an action that has good consequences, if you say something that leads to somebody acting in a way that is positive, or if you act in a way that is going to lead to positive or good consequences, then that action, irrespective of whether it is defined narrowly within the context of madhabi sharia, is also good. This is the most dangerous one, because here, by defining good and evil, also in terms of its benefit, you end up in areas that are in direct conflict, often, with injunctions, with ahadith, with fatwas, with historically accepted positions on critical issues that in many ways define the nature of Muslims and Muslim civilization. I give an example of banking and riba. And here, by giving a kind of, I won't say it was never, I don't think he was known to be a reader of Bentham or people like that, but to give a utilitarian basis for religious injunctions, introduced this notion of utility, which we find around us all the time. A lot of the modernist types will give you positive fatwas on the basis that it is ultimately in the public interest. So whatever is in the public interest becomes generally sanctioned, not by reason, but by medieval notions or traditional notions of good and evil.
So we can say as well, it makes things easy for people to decide whatever they want to do, their own opinion, without referring to ulama.
One of the common threads in his life is that he wanted to restrict as much as possible the areas which are specifically forbidden. The halal and haram. He wanted to reduce to a very, very, very narrow path. Now, you may or may not be in a position to reverberate with that or to resonate with that. Many people do. Many people have gone back to the Quran. Again, it's a way of rereading the text. If you reread the text in a way that says everything is allowable except what is specifically forbidden, which is in many ways an Anglo-Saxon approach to moral law and ethics.
Has anybody claimed that he was a plant?
A plant.
A plant in the Muslim Ummah, that he was bribed, he was paid off. I mean,
maybe. Yeah, I mean, you can ascribe to these things. I don't think there's a gigantic conspiracy where all of these people are nurtured at the age of 3 to think and act and behave in a certain way. First of all, it's not humanly possible. And secondly, there is other much easier ways than relying on the accident of this guy being raised in order to reach this position. There are many theories on it. I don't subscribe to them, but you can. I don't, but there's no evidence to that. The evidence is that he was a person who it's not that he wanted to renew Islamic civilization or the Islamic modes of conduct. He did not strengthen Islam as such. What he wanted to do was to say, listen, you guys think that you have the answers to the riddle of existence. We do too. The problem is that we really don't know how to go about doing it because we haven't gotten our axis correct. Once we get our axis correct, we'll be able to face you on a level playing field. But in the process, he threw the baby with the bathwater. Or he didn't, but his followers or those who used his notions threw the baby with the bathwater. But by and large, I think, is, as I said, if you read Badawi's article on which I did, you find that Badawi, by and large, writes him off as a negative. But there are many other people who think of him as really as the greatest force for good. Yes, no, Zakir of Muslim. Yes. He's probably one of the. There are two great scholars on Muhammad Abduh. One of them is Zakir Badawi. The other one is a man called Muhammad Ammar, who is in Egypt. And Muhammad Ammar is much more of a supporter and apologist for this. I'll also try to go through one of the famous debates that we had. If you recall, I discussed about 2 weeks ago Sayyid Jamaluddin's debates with Renan. Muhammad Abduh had a similar debate with one of Renan's followers by the name of Muhammad. And again, this fellow was a poor version of Renan. He also became minister in one of the French cabinets of the Third Republic. And the main concerns in France those days was how to cement and strengthen French occupation of Algeria. And the French in Algeria moved from being just an occupying power to supporting the principle of colonization in terms of the planting of peoples and gradually transforming the nature of the country and society. And again, it's one of the old polemics, as it were, between those who, in the West, who see Islam in racial, cultural terms, and the apologists and defenders of Islam. Now, Hanato said there are 3 ways of handling Islam. One of them is to think of Islam as being completely dangerous to humanity. He said you should kill a fifth of all Muslims, imprison the rest, astaghfirullah, destroy the Kaaba, and turn them into slaves. That's was theory. Islam is a threat. In a variant form, you see it today also. But no, it's not. It's actually a complete secular. The other way of looking at Islam, and Islam is a threat, therefore destroy it. The other way of seeing Islam is that Islam is manifestly superior. Therefore, you should all become Muslims. And the third way is that Islam is a bridge to a higher reality, which he calls Christianity. Again, we have these 19th century concepts of race and culture, and Hanato, drawing to a large extent from Renan, interprets Islam really in racial cultural terms. And he says that Semites are basically monotheistic. Semites are basically people who want to put man completely under the domination of a transcendent reality of God. While Christianity is more of an Aryan religion, and Aryanism want to elevate man to God. So, in the final analysis, Christianity talks about the Trinity, and one of the Trinity is man. Jesus is man. Therefore, man has God-like capabilities and attributes. While the strict monotheism of Islam, or the Semites, puts a huge gap between man and a transcendent God, and therefore man is always in a subservient relationship to his creator. Abduh's response is probably more interesting than Hanato's thesis, because Hanato was saying that as part of this, as it were, the cultural war that was being waged against Muslim Algerians. And there was a struggle going on in France whether they should limit their involvement in Algeria and then gradually withdraw, and between those who wanted to colonize Algeria and turn it into really exactly this kill a fifth of the population, enslave the rest, and dominate. His answer, Abdu's answer to these claims about Islam also shows you a lot about what he thinks in terms of the relative virtues of the West and Islam and Muslims. He says that to say that it's a Semitic religion is false. He says monotheism is associated with the Hebrews. It is not associated with the Arabs. Arabs before Islam were pagans. So were those of the other parts of the Muslim, whatever race and color they were. Phoenicians were polytheists, Africans were polytheists and pagans before they became Muslims, and so on and so forth. And Muslims in this case, or Islam in this case, should not be linked to any specific racial group. So to equate Islam with Semitic cultures, because Islam is monotheistic, this is the point. The main Semitic proponents of monotheism before the Arabs were the Hebrews or the Jews. And so at the same time to posit that Aryanism or the West generally is in favor of elevation of man to a godlike state is really false, because if you look at the homeland of Aryanism, which is Hinduism, or the Hindus, you have there the most caste-driven system and the most gradation that is possible. His third answer is really the most interesting in terms of his own evolution of ideas. Hanato talked about the dependence or the subservience of man to God in Islam implies a certain predeterminism. That is, it implies a certain subservience to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore man is not free to do anything, and it encourages fatalism. This is a common argument that you hear even today. And this goes back again to the historical time, to the famous debates just after between the Qadiriyya and the Jabariya. I'm sure you've heard that in your theology course. That is between those followers of free will and those followers of predestination. Abduh says that this entire notion of Qadiriyya, Jabariya, of predestination and free will is really not in Islam. It's nothing to do with Islam. This whole debate is really outside of the ambit. It was introduced into Islam by Greeks and Persians. And therefore anything that the West says about the fatalist nature of Muslims, that we all lie back and waiting for the date tree to give its fruit, or the banana tree to drop its fruit, and so on, and to accept whatever comes to us as being the creed, is really nothing to do with the original spirit of Islam. The original spirit of Islam does not talk about the absolute need, as it were, to abandon will, which is part of the implication of what the fatalist attitude means. And he said that both of these are debates that were introduced into Islam by Greeks, by Hellenistic philosophy, and by the Persians. And as a consequence of that, these intrusions, non-authentic intrusions into Islam, corrupted Islam. So when you attack the fatalism of Islam and Muslims, you're not really attacking true Islam. What you really should be attacking are Hellenistic intrusions into Islam. And this is a common theme that we find, that Islam, in its pristine purity, is incapable of reaching any state of which the West is critical. What he's doing is answering Western criticism. He's not giving any true definition of what the state and situation of Muslims is, as well as what Islam properly understood, whatever that means. He's addressing Western concerns with that here you have a nation imprisoned in a philosophy that is trapped in time, that is trapped in a way of thinking that is not conducive to modernism. And here we have people, even today, make the argument that Islam is incapable of modernizing. A man called Conor Cruz O'Brien wrote a whole book on this, about 5 years ago, that Islam is incapable of adapting to modernity because of this. He developed also a kind of evolutionary perspective of Islam. And he was very much greatly influenced for some reason, he was taken up by Darwin. And he had hundreds of books about him, about Darwin, about social Darwinism, about the theory of evolution, things like that. And that, I believe, seeped into his writings by accepting, as it were, a kind of curious perspective on evolution. He introduced the notion of evolution into the progress of civilization. This was really quite common in the late 19th century, where biological determinism of Darwin seeped into social sciences and began to color, as it were, the thoughts of a large number of people. And you have people like Spencer, whose entire philosophy is based on a kind of social Darwinism, struggle, natural selection, struggle for survival, that what we see is a result of endless evolution. He applied that also to peoples and to religions. And his answer is that the three monotheistic, or the so-called monotheistic religions, of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were stages of in the progress of the human mind and the progress of the human state. Judaism began to propagate among Hebraic peoples and relied on things like miracles all the time. And if you read the Old Testament, it's full of all kinds of extra sensory activities or extra miraculous occurrences. And therefore it is, of the three religions, the most primitive in an evolutionary sense. As man progressed and as civilizations and communities progressed and cultures progressed, you moved from just a religion based on the extraordinary demonstrations of the power of the Supreme Creator, parting of the Red Sea and things like that, to a sense of both that as well as the sentiment of man. So you have the sense of love, the sense of redemption that exists within Christianity. So Christianity is another step up the ladder in the religious evolutionary state or condition of man, until you reach Islam. And Islam is superior to all of them because it combines both the appeal to sentiment, the appeal to the attributes, to love, to generosity, to redemption, to forgiveness, and so on. It combines that with reason and does not rely on external miraculous events of an extraordinary nature that both Christianity and Judaism. And he goes back to demonstrating that there is no miracles in the history of Islam. We do not rely on miracles, and if there is any miraculous event, it is the Quranic descent. Apart from that, all miraculous actions of the Prophet ﷺ are not to be given much veracity, and that all these karamats and the barakats of the awliyas, as you call them, or the saints of Islam, are all just a lot of mind juggling. And Islam is par excellence the religion of the nobler attributes, nobler meanings, as well as reason. So that again, his answer to Honorable is probably one of the ways in which he can determine his attitude towards how he saw his own faith, his own culture, and how he related that to the West. And it is really, in some ways, a defensive posture. He's defending Islam against accusations thrown at him. At the same time, he is recreating an Islam that appeals to rationalists and to modern-minded people. Again, a state of mind, a state of condition that you probably see around us all the time. That is the explanation that Islam is Deen al-Aql. I've heard that so many times. As Islam is a religion of reason, or Islam is equal to modernity. There is nothing in modern life, in technology, progress, and science, and so on, that cannot be found in Islam. In some ways, this is what I would call a dependent explanation. In some ways, it takes away from the validity, the energy, and the vigor of the deen that is universal in its roots and in its orientation, and trying to make it, package it in a way that is acceptable to the other, as well as acceptable to people in their own community who have begun to fall, as it were, for the silent song of the West. We'll take 5 minutes and then we'll continue further.
It seems that Islam has many colours. Multi-layered. It's hard really to figure them out where exactly.
Did he actually say that all the three religions were evolution in a sense? From Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, stops at Islam?
Yes, I'll talk later, inshallah, about why in his scheme of things there is a need to end prophecy. But the end of prophecy to him is not because it is a command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as people who are faith would say. The end of prophecy is a sociological necessity. Man, civilizations have grown to the point where they don't need to be convinced by miraculous events. You can always appeal to people's reason. And he places that somewhere around the 7th century with the emergence of prophecy. Right? But that is a sociological perspective. And this is of course an Islamic idea, so please don't modern Islamic idea. It's not to be confused with Aqidah and so on. I'm talking about how our current mindset has been formed and where these ideas come from.
By his way of unique thinking, he tried to inform the Allawi discussion. In a sense, when he was talking about intrinsically good, the Ash'ari did not believe that there is any action that is intrinsically good. To them, they believe that all the acts that Allah should
Yes, he did. He of course, he had some, you mentioned that he had certain contradictory elements in his character. He did. In the end, towards the third part of his life, he was a great follower of the Salafiyya school. He started reinterpreting Ibn Taymiyyah and things like that. Which makes it very odd that a person who reinterprets Ibn Taymiyyah at the same time talks for doctrinal unity between the methods. And it's very odd also for a person like Ibn Taymiyyah, who's immersed in the Hanbali fiqh, which is in many ways anthropomorphic. Yad Allah is the hand of God, it's actual hand. To say that in one case, and then to call for the allegorical and metaphorical interpretations of the Quran, which is the hallmark, in my mind, of all modernist Muslims, that the Quran has to be interpreted metaphorically, and not only the Bible. There's also a bottom there. And he also opened the door to things. He's a great lover of science, but without really understanding science. He did not understand the principles of scientific logic. unfortunately, I mean, I'll say that, I don't know that I should say that, but unfortunately that mindset is quite common with all our so-called intellectuals and thinkers, ranging from anyone, including those who are most known, A Allawi. Anybody who comes from this modernist apologist tradition is not really aware of the conceptual framework of the ideas that they are attacking or that they are discussing. Science, for example. I mean, science does not work in the way that most of these Muslim modernists think. The way that science advances, the way that the whole logic of scientific experiment and discovery is not the way that these people think. They understand a very journalistic or polemical perspective. That's why they're not taken seriously, frankly, by thinkers in the serious intellectuals. Not taken seriously. Muhammad Abduh, for example, knew very little about science, but then to try to use what little he knew about science and use that as the principle of interpreting the Quran. And he talked about the jinn. When he was faced with, well, what does the jinn need from modernist and secularist thinking? He said, well, the jinn is the Quranic indication of the existence of microbes. Well, you cannot see microbes, and there is a whole...
It's like the dangerous in India. They used to think that as well. That's why they don't really repeat it. I mean, it's
I know, it's more than that. I mean, I found throughout modern Muslim history, the history of ideas, there has been really very little knowledge of Western, the phenomenological basis of Western thought, the theory of knowledge of the Westerns, or the underpinnings of logic and science and reason. Our grasp of it is much less than people like Farabi or Ghazali, for instance. They knew what they were talking about. Most of these people don't know what they're talking about. And he saw science. He used to say that every time he wanted to be re-energized spiritually, he went to the West. He traveled quite frequently to the West after that region. And obviously he was taken aback by the state of civilization, culture. Not culture, but state of the material globally compared to what he's done.
Sorry, I was a little break.
Yes.
Could I take those 10 minutes now? If I'm not packing something,
We'll keep the end of the talk. We'll just continue to answer your questions. Any observations?
I'm thinking of modernization. Is your main modernization what we start of modernization and the new modernization?
I mean, he was one of the originators of the whole school, but a school is one that where you accumulate. It starts off with one or two people, and then more and more add. So what we have today really is a big jumble, as it were, of people whose main interest is to so-called modernize. The notion of using the word modernization itself is incorrect. Because Islam does not need to be modernized. I mean, it's not a question of modernizing something. How can you modernize something that's eternal, that's outside of time? The perceptions of it are more political, sociological, and cultural. Right? Islamic modernizers, in all forms and shapes, are those who want to rejuvenate the power and strength of the civilization, rather than try to make people live a life that is more quote-unquote Muslim. What do you think?
To me, he was a man of a lot of contradiction to himself in a sense. He was looking for science, but he, in a sense, he behind philosophy, inquiring of people of Muslims were philosophy while he was in India. Which is, I think, if we relate back to your point, when you're saying that Muslims have not managed to grasp the framework of Western ideas of science, Western ideas of organization. I think this is we look, say, Jamaluddin al-Afghani in this viewpoint, we will see that he has done a service in the sense that he started to do that. That's why he started going everywhere, speaking about, using reason and philosophy. Unfortunately, one of his main students did not pursue that same line of thought.
Yes, I think his main student also had he was a weak man in many ways. He was in some ways authoritarian in a way. He's dogmatic in whatever positions he took. He was authoritarian, but he was weak. Maybe he was in some ways, I don't want to give national stereotypes, but the accommodation of authority tends to be a characteristic of people who come from that part of the world. And don't talk about accommodate, accept existing rule, unless it becomes impossible to tolerate. So in some ways it's the whole ethos, as it were, of that establishment that pushes for accommodation. Well, Muhammad Abduh will reach the end of one group of people. We talk mainly about Arabs, those who participated in various capacities, various roles as defenders of Islam, as those physical defenders of Islam, in jihad and to activists, those who wanted to strengthen the boundaries and the power of the civilization of Islam, like Sayyid Jamaluddin. Reformers who tried to understand and grasp the threat that was coming from the West. And people who started the process of changing institutions, especially educational institutions, to accommodate the needs of the age. And in the tertiary period of his life, he became, as I said earlier, a pedagogue, very much interested in the philosophy of education, how to reform Muslim education establishments in order to create a group of people who are able to meet the challenges of the modern world. He, of course, thought that the earlier reforms by either the Ottomans or Muhammad Ali were really limited to creating a group of people who could administer the state, who could administer the functions of modern state. They were not so much concerned about the mass, the welfare of the mass. And his educational program in the region was directed really towards that, directed towards the reform, mainly of secondary schools and primary schools, to allow the introduction of modern sciences, languages, without detracting from the traditional orientation. He also wanted to revamp and restructure the educational curriculum, as it were, the Azhar. And here he met a lot of resistance from people who could not understand where this was going to lead, and whether it would lead anywhere.
Yeah, actually, was there a need to all these kind of changes they wanted to bring in?
Well, he thought there was a need, yes. He thought that they were creating ulamas who are incapable of understanding the modern world, and therefore, by what right do these people have to comment on and judge people's lives? In some ways, he may have been correct. The Azhar was stuck in a certain way of teaching, and with a certain curriculum that produced a mindset that was peculiar to it. But that, if it was limited to that class of people, fine. And these people lived in their own orbit, fine. But these people were also responsible for the administration of laws and justice in some cases. They also had important social and educational role to play. And he said, you cannot have people like that talking about Islam, talking about deen, talking about and giving judgments, who are ignorant of what's happening outside. Now, his solution to that was to add science faculties to Azhar and things like that, which ended up in what we have today, which is neither here nor there, worst of possible institutions. traditional form of education, limited to those who want to become alims, and a modern, so-called modern education, to those who want to become engineers and technicians and so on. So you had this conflict within one institution. One did not overcome the other, or one did not even intertwine with the other. And if you go to really every so-called modern institution in the Muslim world, it is like that. It is an uneasy arrangement between two different worlds, neither of which is taught very well, neither of which is explained very well. And this imbalance, this grafting, as it were, of one to another, creates a great deal of mediocrity. He was also concerned with things like the threat that foreign schools or foreign missionary schools have on the local elites. He said that people who wanted what's best for their children would not send them to traditional schools, because they knew that the person who comes out from a school run by missionaries or run by foreign groups is going to find a job, is going to find prestige, is going to be able to earn a living. A guy coming out of a traditional nectar is going to be unemployable, basically. Again, you have the same problem today in a place like Saudi Arabia, where there are hundreds of thousands of graduates of traditional schools with no jobs. And you have the plum jobs and the plum assignments in the country assigned to people who are either Western educated or who went to missionary schools abroad. Algeria had the same problem. You have a problem where the mass of the people have gone to traditional Arabic language instruction, coming out into a market that only recognizes Francophile and modern qualifications. So you have an army of people who are unemployed. And the culture of the elite is not changed. I'm sure it's true in many other countries. And this duality, this dual education, very poor traditional education for the mass, and a very narrow, culturally alien education for the elite. It's throughout the Muslim world. Wherever you go, it's
what has to be done in order to change to bring in the balance? Because it is true, it makes us.
You can join the Taliban, that's one way.
It makes some. It's not easy anyway. But the thing is, I don't know, it is true.
What's your solution?
Well, I'm thinking about it, but up to now I haven't come to this.
Some people have pushed for the Islamization of knowledge as well.
Yeah, well, they've run out of money to follow that program, so they published 30 books, so that's it.
Yeah, I think
And look at the Islamic University movement. It started off the whole thing was triggered by an article by a man called Naqib Abbas. He wrote it in 1973, positing the need for an Islamic university which is based upon the traditional relationships between master, a qualified master, and his pupils, rather than the Western sense of hierarchy and assistant professors and associate professors and lecturers, and paid lecturers and unpaid lecturers, all of that. This is the modern Western university hierarchy. You have against that the Islamic University movement. It was then taken up by the Islamic Conference, the OIC, and a number of Islamic universities were established. First one was in Islamabad. There's one established in Malaysia. There's one established in Bangladesh. There's one established. There's about 6 or 7 around the world. Within a very short period of time, they came under the same method of administration, the same method of course content, the same method as any Western university, as the national university, as the other private universities in that country. The end result is that you have Western universities that call themselves Islamic, and that teach every other Western course. Probably not as well as the Western, but carry this epithet, Islamic, for this suffix or prefix or whatever. This can, to some extent, be blamed on this prophet, Sheikh Abduh, for allowing this kind of very uneasy relationship between two unequal parts, one of which is much more contemporary, and one of which is more traditional. And obviously, if you're looking for an engineer, or if you're looking for somebody who's an administrator or a manager and so on, you're going to go for a person who has the right approach and the right technology to handle basically a Western creation. On the other hand, you have an army of people who are very poorly trained in their own tradition, coming out into the job market or into the world with no equipment, no equipment to handle it. So, as you said, the Islamization of knowledge is one thing. This is one way of trying to recreate various disciplines, but re-engineering, as it were, from a Muslim perspective. How successful that is, I don't know, because it has not been tried on a mass basis. But something like that, I think, must happen. Something like a redefinition or a re-engineering of disciplines and courses. But I think it all has to relate to means and ends. It is what we want. If you want to be a successful businessman, working on the 19th floor of some tower, you are unlikely to go through a system that's not going to produce that for you. So you are going to go to the system that's going to produce exactly that. You're going to go to a Western oriented system. You're going to go to a system that is designed to create this class or this group of people. So it is not to do with Islamizing disciplines, or it is not to do with modernizing things. It's to do really with what people's own desires are and what their own needs are. You cannot be a person who is deeply immersed in the truth of Islam if you want to end up being a bank manager. You can't be both. You have to make your choice. At the same time, you should not be expected to run a dam where the lives of hundreds of thousands of people are there using Aristotelian physics. It doesn't work. You cannot go back and try to re-engineer Newton's laws by using discredited physical theories. So, it is to do with means and ends. It is to do with not cause and effect, but means and ends. And whichever means you present and that you really think are yours authentically is what drives you to do what you do. And from that, I think, a demand arises. And that hopefully will translate into courses, curricula, educational systems, teaching methods, and so on.
What would benefit from these studies and something?
Inshallah, yes. It all starts with the person, with the individual. And if that individual is imprisoned in a certain way of thinking, and he desires certain things that can only be reached legitimately by assuming certain mindsets, then that's what he has to do. There's no other way. Anyway, I think we have exhausted the subject of his impact. So, unless you have any questions, observations, comments?
Yeah, what make someone like, for example, Abduh? He started the way we see it as a student transfer, as a
Thank you very much. Started
started as a naive, if I can use the word, from an Islamic institution. But at the end you find him is a very controversial man, not easy to understand. Maybe it could help us to understand what makes someone to start in a very good way and to end with these different types of ideas, keeping in mind that the upbringing helps someone to either to go to Jannah or to hell.
Well, I cannot comment on the level of his faith. I really cannot say. Who am I to say whether he was a believer? He may have been a great believer. He may be an unbeliever. I think we can only deal with the man on the basis of his actions, not on the basis of what goes on in his mind. There's no doubt in my mind that he changed. I mean, Zaki Badawi talks about changes in emphasis. It's more than that. I think his relationship with power, his relationship with people changed in a fundamental way at the time. This may be due to the cycles of man. You're all young people. But when you're middle-aged, you look at the world through different perspectives. You may not believe that, but you will. And when you're older, you look at that from a different perspective. Generally, though, I believe that and in this case I think it's true, his earlier impulses were probably the best definition of his character. He was a moderate man. He was dogmatically moderate, if that can make sense. He wanted to make of moderation a religion. He wanted to make of toleration and tolerance a kind of dogma. He was, I think, a person who was easily seduced by power and afraid physically. I think he was physically afraid. He was a person who was not necessarily the most courageous man. He fell under the control of his life. A number of people. In his young days, Sheikh Darwish. Sheikh Darwish writes about it in his writings in ways that are, I won't say blasphemous, but he would not talk about, Wali Allah this way. And he transferred that allegiance, that total allegiance, to Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani. And Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani's relation to the letters to him, again, some of them are very, very deep, and very deep in the sense of loyalty to him, deep in the sense of love to him, deep in the sense of obedience to him. Something that you would not write to a friend or a teacher, more than that. It's like a disciple. So you can sense from that, from his psychology, that he needed to be under the tutelage or control, or he fell under easily under the control of dominant personalities. Later on in his life, he fell under the control of Koma. As a human being, not as an agent of the British. Against this, I think, he loved to be in a position that was near power, near authority. And those who are near power and near authority sometimes make a grab for power and authority. If they see power and authority, begin to disintegrate. And that's what he did when the rule of the Ismail began to disintegrate. And the Arabi relationship, he thought that by supporting it, he may very well end up in a position of power and influence. So that's another streak in him. He wanted to be near power, near influence, where he's able to bask, as it were, in the power of the rulers. That's on the, if you want to call it, negative side. I don't want to call it negative or positive, but that's a side to him. The other side to him, I think, he was a moderate man. And Egypt generally produces moderate people. It produces moderate, tolerant people. He was a moderate man. He wanted to skim over differences. He did not want to focus on what distances people and distances ideas from each other. He wanted to bring things together. He wanted to have a kind of, he wanted to be a bridge between sects and groups. He's more interested in unity than he was in interested in groups and sects. So this, in my mind, reflects a basic tolerance, and which you find throughout, I think, the Egyptian ulama, that there is a strong tolerance. And I say any person who wants to stop the Wahhabi movement, its tracks should all support the Azhar, because the Azhar does do these things. There is a streak in the Egyptian religious hierarchy that calls for intersectarian compromise, that pushes for compromise, pushes for a sense of a non-dogmatic perception of the deen. That, I think, is a positive. It's a very positive. And from that strain, as it were, you can get all the various institutions and organizations and conferences that brought Muslims together, that try to create an institution. That's another aspect of it. Another aspect of his character, which may go again with the tolerance and moderation that is found usually in Egypt, is a reluctance to physically confront people, or fear for physical safety. I don't want to call it lack of courage, but caution, extreme caution. Being careful in positions that you take, being aware of the limits of your potential, not to exceed that. That also, in its negative form, allows you to tolerate abuse and to tolerate killing for a long time. And some of these accusations towards the end of his life were thrown at him, that he tolerated all kinds of abuse, especially by the British, of their power and role, that he wasn't prepared to confront them. He wasn't prepared to raise the banner of the anti-imperialist struggle, as it were. He accepted British rule for what it was. So all these contradictory strains come up. But if you tell me, was he a man of Islam, was he a man of the West? He was a man of Islam. If you take all of that together, where would you put it? Was he, as it were, an effendi, a person wearing Western dress with Western mind, but talking in Islamic terms? Or was he a person who was from a traditional background and stayed in that background, to try to understand the West, and try to understand modernization in ways that were more advanced, more sophisticated than the earlier predecessors?
He was writing quite honestly. But I like to know is why, do we have historical records and why is he separate from the family of Abduh?
I think it's to do with the crafts of Urwa al-Wufqa is shrouded in mystery. He was approached by Khdawi Tawfiq, the ruler of Egypt, to do a deal. And that meant he had to compromise with the British, basically. And the whole tone of Urwa al-Wufqa, the newspaper that came out of Paris, was very violently anti-British. Very violent. And if you read some of the copies of it, very, very violent. So he was not prepared to follow Sayyid Jamaluddin to the bitter end. At some point he weighed his interests. He saw probably a newspaper that had lost its finances, about to collapse. What does an Egyptian alim do in 19th century France? What can he do? So where does he go? So Sayyid Jamaluddin was basically a ruthless man. He could go anywhere. I'm surprised he didn't go to America. He went everywhere around the world. Remember when I showed you where he went? He was much more of a rooted man, this person. He loved his country. He wanted to be in Egypt. He didn't want to be in exile in Paris. And when he saw that this alternative life that he might have with Jamaluddin al-Mahdi was not to his liking. He was a follower, don't forget, when he was living in Cairo. So he had the stability there, his family there, his environment was stable. And he could dabble in extreme politics and philosophizing on the side. But to live a life of exile for a person who is unprepared for it is hell. So I think he did a deal. Said Jamaluddin found out about it.